what we're facing now with the decarbonisation agenda, with road vehicles and cars, most especially front and centre, they represent the substantial proportion of emissions from transport in the UK, is the concurrent development and its growing pains to do with the vehicle technology being available, but then charging infrastructure to keep pace with the demand from consumers for that technology. So we have this ongoing challenge whereby we're trying to bring about a transition in vehicle technology, of course, across the UK and more globally, but at the same time trying to make sure that the infrastructure keeps pace with that, which frankly it seems to be struggling to do. That's not to say, of course, that there aren't substantial endeavours underway to keep pace, but a sense at the moment perhaps that as we're seeing significantly increased sales of battery electric vehicles, new vehicle sales, that's starting to put pressure on the existing network of recharging infrastructure, and so its accelerated rollout becomes especially important. I think the question that arises from that is one of capacity and capability to be able to fulfill the need for that infrastructure rollout in a way that is sensitive to the wider context of the transport system and street environments, so that we're not simply providing a technology quick fix, as it were, to being able to recharge a vehicle, but looking at the longer term implications of how that infrastructure is created and introduced into our built environments.
Obviously, you commented on the designs for some of the rapid chargers which are being installed across Devon. Are you seeing any examples of good practice, and are there any examples of public charging facilities which raise some alarms with you?
It would certainly appear at this stage that there are a variety of types of charger, both in terms of the speed with which they can charge and the requirements therefore they have in terms of being wired in, but also the size of that infrastructure, the charging units, and perhaps most crucially, where they're located. So of course there are off-road locations such as supermarket car parks, where at least they're able to be better managed in terms of where they're introduced. What we have, of course, are historical street networks across urban areas in the UK where it's not so straightforward to introduce them into that environment retrospectively, as it were. The challenges that is then presenting is whether the space requirements for that new infrastructure are in conflict with road space, including space for parked cars, or pedestrian and wheelchair users, pushchair users, space on the pavements. And what appears to be happening in some cases now is that the pedestrian environment, if I can simplify in those terms, the pavement is being abused in order to ensure we don't impede the move across to electric vehicles. When, of course, vehicles in the round, cars in particular, are already in some cases overrunning built environments and encroaching on pavements by virtue of how they're parked, let alone adding the charging infrastructure and questions over whether or not there are cables, retractable or not, and how people take things into their own hands to manage the safety implications. But the streetscape is being changed all the while. There are clearly examples where the installations are on the road, in effect in between where parked vehicles would be, so that they can charge from either side of the vehicle alongside the pavement. There may well be very good technical reasons why that's not always possible, but that seems eminently more attractive and appropriate than introducing them onto already crowded pavements. Pavements which, of course, we see in many parts of the UK now, as I've said, not only have parked cars on them now, but also have household recycling bins and other street furniture. So it's already a crowded space, which rather comes into conflict with the government's own transport decarbonisation plan, within which it said that by 2040 we would have world-class cycling and walking infrastructure in the UK. And given some of the installations that have emerged of charging units, it's pushing the state of our pavements in the opposite direction, distinctly away from world-class.
Do you think this is just teething pains in some ways? Because obviously there are different approaches in different parts of the country. We'll start to see a bit more of a standardization when this technology becomes more widely available.
Very likely we will see an evolution, perhaps quite a rapid evolution in terms of the form and function of recharging units as the infrastructure develops and matures across the UK, and of course as battery technology changes, recharging times and so on. The challenge, I think, is how much legacy recharging infrastructure will already have been created by the time we reach a point where perhaps we're saying we've really got the hang of this now, and we can do it in the most sensitive and effective way for all road users, rather than simply fulfilling targets to install charging units to meet a rollout agenda that will ensure the overall transition to electric vehicles isn't hampered by lack of charging units and indeed perception of lack of charging units. So understandable that to some extent it's a messy transition. There will be a few stutters and false starts in terms of what that infrastructure, charging infrastructure, looks like. But we do need to learn the lessons and identify best practice as quickly as possible. That may relate to a degree of capacity constraint, because after all, we're trying to do this in a massively parallel sense rather than introducing it in a more leisurely, linear process of introducing it in one place, learning from that, introducing it into another town or city. This is having to happen more rapidly. So arguably less than desirable installations are sometimes emerging, which relates perhaps in part to questions of procurement and quality control between the suppliers and those procuring these installations.
Do you think we'll see conflict in the short term between, the numbers of people that want to charge their cars, the numbers of available chargers? Can you see potential issues? And, do you have any thoughts about that?
I think there are potential issues arising, yes, in terms of supply and demand, of course, for charging. If people have taken the step to acquire an electric vehicle, they will be going into that with some concerns over how convenient it's going to be to recharge their vehicle where and when they want to, without too much hold up, delay, and so on. And undoubtedly, we're already seeing anecdotal evidence, not least about people having to queue, perhaps for longer distance holiday journeys where they're less familiar with their charging options. But it is worth noting the recent RAC report on motoring for this year. So a survey of motorists identified, if I recall, that something like 40% of motorists have not made a journey over 200 miles in the last year. And what that's pointing to is that, just as with our petrol or diesel vehicles, we're not trying to fill them up every day typically. Sometimes, for some people, not even every week. So it's the difference, I think, between perception and reality when it comes to conflicts of more demand than supply. And perhaps part of the solution there is, just as we rely upon apps for supporting our digital lives in other ways, that there's the notion of smart charging, where you're made aware that your vehicle charge is running down, and so you have a lead in time to identify where and when you might recharge it, rather than this notion that everyone is desperately needing on a daily basis to recharge as close to home as they possibly can. Of course, we need more understanding about that to make sense of where certain pinch points might be, which in turn can inform the prioritization of charging units continuing to be rolled out. The broad issue for me, on the one side, we know we're in code red. We know that COP26 outcomes, whilst they might represent some degree of progress, they're falling short of what some are now trying to convince the UN is officially a level 3 emergency for the planet. So in one sense, we need to bring in technology fix where people are going to continue to use their vehicles. We want tailpipe emissions to be reduced and removed as quickly as possible. The question is that coming at any cost? And the cost potentially is that we're allowing a continuation, if not an escalation, of the dominance of the motor car in our built environments. And many governments recognise at least the principle of having a modal hierarchy where walking and wheeling are at the top and the car is at the bottom. And yet what we seem to be seeing, or at risk of seeing, is an inversion of that hierarchy in practice, where quite frankly, it almost appears as if pedestrian pavements are being redesignated as service lanes for recycling bins, for parked cars and for charging units, which really makes a mockery of the notion of a modal hierarchy. So we need, as we quite often say, more joined up thinking in this progression towards a better mobility future that's lower carbon.